Él solo quería arreglar una rueda y avanzar. Solo necesitaba un día de amistad. Pero con la soledad del pasado que había ocultado, vino a caminar no con venganza, sino con algo que nadie vio venir. La rueda se rompió en la carretera de la rueda, a la mitad de nada y de nada. Y a la vez que Joanna Red la volvió a levantar suficiente para deslizarse en el rostro, la soledad ya tenía heridas en sus nervios. No lloró, no cuando la rueda se rompió, no cuando su hijo Caleb preguntó si se iban a dormir en el rostro de nuevo, y no cuando vio a la trampa de los blacksmiths caer justo mientras su llave de disculpas se deslizaba hacia la vista. Solo respiró una vez, cerró los ojos, y dijo calmamente: «Quédate sentado, Caleb». Luego bajó, arrastró la carretera de sus palmas y salió directamente a la forja. No tenía dinero. No realmente. Unas cuantas monedas salvadas de intercambios de hilo y botones, pero de ningún lado suficientes para una nueva rueda. Solo lo suficiente para tal vez arruinar a alguien con un trabajo de patina si no eran particulares en cuanto a calidad. Respiró cuando el blacksmith se volvió completamente hacia ella con una camisa grande y suelta de suelto, atrapada en su pecho suelo en sus brazos, y el tipo de mirada que no se deslizaba fácilmente. «Ruida», dijo simplemente. «Split bad. No puede seguir». El hombre no habló al principio. Solo limpió su brazo y miró hacia el chico sentado pacientemente en la trampa rompida. Luego finalmente dijo: «Tú, Joanna Red». Se congeló. Lo dijo como si fuera una pregunta, pero no la que necesitara respuestas. Lentamente ella gritó. El blacksmith no sonrió. Solo gritó, caminó por encima de la rueda rompida y se acercó. Estudió el split, llevó una mano a lo largo del daño y tapó el tubo una vez. «No es la primera vez que se rompe», no admitió Joanna. «Lo intenté arreglar yo misma». Se sostuvo más tiempo de lo que debería haber hecho entonces. Se sostuvo de nuevo limpiando la piedra de la espada de sus manos. «¿Lo arreglaré? Puedes pagar después». «No tengo después, Joanna», dijo suavemente sus dientes, apretándose alrededor de la espada rompida de su espalda. «Y no vine aquí a pedir, no lo hiciste», dijo volviéndose a la forja. «Viste que tuviste que arreglar una rueda». Luego le agregó sin volver: «Nombre de Eli Garner. No tomará mucho tiempo», no era amabilidad en su tono. No exactamente. Fue algo más silencioso. Como si no le estuviera haciendo un favor solo arreglando una deuda antes de que la piedra se volviera demasiado larga. Joanna lo observó por un momento. Luego se volvió a la forja. Caleb lo miró. «¿Lo arreglará?», sí, dijo. «Lo arreglará». A medianoche la rueda se abrió. La forja se volvió más caliente y Eli trabajó sin hablar más que unas palabras. Caleb observó con ojos amplios mientras formaba nuevos espacios adaptándolos a la forja, limpiando el borde y cerrándolo. Joanna quedó cerca pero nunca en camino. De vez en cuando agarró agua. Una vez le trajo un cuchillo de café de la tienda general pagado con sus 2 últimas copas. Lo tomó sin agradecimientos, pero no lo refusó. «¿Eres del oeste?», le preguntó una vez cuando regresó de la brújula de las botas de Caleb. Ella gritó: «Ashfield», antes de que la cólera llegara. «Long way from Ashfield». «Eli», dijo. «Largo suficiente», Joanna respondió. «Ese chico es tuyo, él lo es». Eli no respondió, pero miró hacia Caleb, quien había dormido en la oscuridad cerca de la forja de las botas con la cabeza abierta sobre su rostro. La nueva rueda estaba lista antes del sol. Estaba firme, limpia, mejor que cualquier cosa que había tenido en años. Eli la apuntó al vagón y la cerró en lugar sin ceremonia. Cuando se terminó, Joanna pasó adelante y se acercó a su sacerdote. «No tengo mucho», ella dijo. «Pero tengo 2 pinos de cabello de silvero. Madre S. Están antiguos. Manténlos, Eli», dijo simplemente. «No los quiero. No lo entiendo». Ella dijo calientemente: «Los hombres no se arreglan los vagones por gratis». Eli miró a ella entonces, realmente miró, y sus ojos no estaban enojados o claros solo cansados. Quizás no dijo. Pero no soy la mayoría de los hombres. Ella estuvo en silencio asombrada mientras limpió sus manos en una bolsa. La cerró de nuevo y se volvió hacia la forja. El aire estaba caliente, ahora el tipo de oscuridad que llevó a los criquetos a salir temprano, y cambió las sombras a lo largo de la tierra. Joanna abrió la boca para agradecerle, pero un sonido rompió la silencio primero. Hoofbeats. 3 de ellos. Ellos vinieron lentos, y lentos no apresurados pero tampoco amigables. La cabeza de Eli se volvió antes de que las de Joanna. La hielo se cruzó en la frontera de la carretera mientras los coches se aproximaban, cada criqueto sentado alto y tranquilo en el asiento. Cuando Joanna vio al hombre al frente, el respiro de su boca en su garganta, su mano instintivamente se dirigió a la forma dormida de Caleb. «Hermanos», respondió. El cuerpo de Eli se movió a su lado, no hostil, pero alerta. Los criquetos se desmontaron en la frontera del jardín de la forja. El líder, con cabello oscuro, cabello como de acero, gritó a Joanna. «No pensé que te encontraríamos tan pronto», le dijo. «¿Qué estás haciendo aquí, Levi?» La voz de Joanna estaba tigra, insegura. «Nos trajimos algo», le respondió agitando su cintura hacia una de las cajas de asiento. «Algo que te dejaste atrás». Eli tomó un paso adelante lo suficientemente para ponerse un poco entre Joanna y los hombres. Levi notó que sus ojos se abrieron un poco. «¿Y quién es este Eli Garner?» Joanna dijo rápidamente. «No es un problema, decidiré que es un problema, Levi», respondió. Luego se volvió a los otros dos. «Muéstralo a ella». El segundo hombre desmanteló la caja de asiento. De ella agarró algo lleno de hielo oscuro, largo, oscuro. Joanna se asustó cuando la vio. Eli no se movió, pero la línea de su brazo se volvió dura. Levi desmanteló lentamente la caja. Y Joanna asustó. Un arma, pero no solo un arma, fueron sus padres. El que había asesinado nunca dejaría sus manos hasta que muriera. Y juzgando por la sangre que aún quedaba en la cinta, la tenía. ¿Por qué respondió casi perdida en el viento? Levi se acercó agarrándola como una ofrenda. Porque eres el último rojo que no tuvo la oportunidad de decidir qué viene a seguir. Joanna se asustó. «No te lo dije, estoy listo con todo eso». El sonrisa de Levi era malvada. «Tan mal que no está listo con ti». Los ojos de Eli nunca dejaron el rostro de Levi. Caleb estiró detrás de ellos, murmuró algo al dormir. Luego se acercó de nuevo. Joanna miró el arma, el corazón golpeando tan duro como sentía en sus dientes. «Tienes hasta la mañana», Levi dijo. «Luego volvemos a caminar con o sin ti». Se volvió sin otra palabra y se montó. Los demás se siguieron. La hielo se levantó en su sueño. Joanna no habló. Eli esperaba. Finalmente ella gritó. «No se suponía encontrarme aquí, pero lo había, y ahora no habría paz, no hasta que lo que se acabara se terminara». La hielo no había separado a la hora en que Joanna tomó el arma. Sus dientes casi borraron el metal antes de que se volviera como si se hubiera quemado. Eli no dijo una palabra. No se movió, no se acercó, no le preguntó. Solo estuvo quieto mientras el peso de 3 hombres llegaba, y la muerte de un hombre. Se sentaba pesada en el jardín de la forja. Finalmente ella se levantó, rompió el arma de nuevo en el hilo, y la sacó bajo el banco de la forja. Caleb aún estaba dormido. No lo había visto. «Eso fue una gracia, no son solo tus hermanos, Eli», dijo voz baja después de demasiado silencio. «Son ellos». Joanna se acercó lentamente. Ella no respondió, no directamente. Estaban muertos cuando la madre murió. No vinieron a la funeral. Ni siquiera escribieron. Pero ahora ella se acercó. Ahora traen a nuestro padre un arma sangrienta como un regalo. Eli no presionó. Solo gritó como si entendiera la lengua de la gente que intenta no caerse. Caleb se movió entonces, rompió los ojos y miró a los dos. «Mamá», murmuró. «Nos quedamos aquí esta noche». Joanna miró hacia el vagón, luego regresó a Eli. «No deberíamos imponer». «No lo eres», dijo ya, volviéndose hacia la funera. «El vagón no va tan lejos en la oscuridad. Tiene un coche vacío en la espalda, puede tomar la cama». Ella hesitó torcida entre el orgullo y la fatiga. En el final, la fatiga ganó. Gracias, dijo suavemente. Eli no respondió. Solo abrió la puerta al lado de la cabina detrás del Smithy y pasó adentro. El coche creó bajo la pesadilla de Joanna. La habitación olía lentamente a hierro y fuego de pines. Caleb se acercó al lado de ella con su cabeza en su brazo, respirando lentamente y suavemente. Joanna miró hacia el centro hasta que sus ojos se abrieron sus pensamientos, cruzando hacia atrás durante años que se habían cerrado. Sus hermanos habían sido crueles antes de que fueran rompidos. Y su regreso, ahora arma sanguínea en la mano, solo podía significar una cosa. Su padre no había muerto en silencio, y ellos no habían venido a decir adiós. El padre se acercó al lado rompiendo la piedra con puestos limpios y brutales. No se miró cuando se acercó a la mesa. Le dijo, «Me voy a ir después del desayuno». Él pausó en medio de la acción con el chico. Sí. ¿Dónde ella miró hacia abajo donde no fueran? ¿Crees que ellos no seguirán? Ella no respondió. El padre se acercó al lado rompiendo la piedra con puestos limpios y brutales. No se miró cuando se acercó a la mesa. Él pausó en medio de la acción. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Ella miró hacia abajo donde no fueran. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Compuestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio de la acción. Él pausó en medio de la acción atentos. Hecho de paso, creo que el dolor de su sorpresa le debe a la paz de su aparición. Él pausó en medio de la acción con puestos limpios y brutales. Él pausó en medio del camino. Él pasó hacia adelante enough. Eli said calmly more than she owed me. Livy laughed low bitter. You think you're the first man who tried to save her. I don't care if I'm the last, Eli said, only that she gets the choice. That stopped Levi just for a second. His face twitched, not with anger but with something older. Maybe grief. He looked at Joanna. You really think walking away will keep Caleb safe? I think killing in his name won't, she said. Levi didn't reply. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but in the end, he just turned, mounted, and rode off at a slow, steady pace. The wagon rolled out an hour later. Joanna kept her eyes forward. Eli didn't wave. He just stood at the edge of the forge with his arms crossed, watching. The road south was quieter than Joanna expected. No riders, no sounds, just dust and the faint rattle of the wheel Eli had repaired. Caleb slept curled beside the blankets, and for a while it felt almost possible that she'd outrun it all until the second night. The first warning was the smoke-thin gray, drifting in from the trees like a whisper. The second was the smell scorched meat pine and something acrid underneath. Joanna stopped the wagon. Caleb sat up, rubbing his eyes. Mama. Stay here, she said. She stepped into the trees and walked toward the smoke. 10 paces and her stomach turned. A wagon burned down to its axles, 2 bodies, one large, one smaller. Not her brother's, but someone else's. Pinned to the side of a blackened tree was a note, in ash-darkened ink. They were warned. Joanna stumbled back to the wagon, her skin crawling. They weren't following her. They were sending messages. She turned the wagon around. Caleb clung to her arm. Mama, what's wrong? She couldn't lie, not now. We're going back, to the man with the hammer. Yes. Is it because of the bad people? Yes. He nodded. Okay. The road back to Rustwood took a day and a half. Eli was there when they returned, standing outside the smithy, hammer in hand, as if he'd never moved. She didn't have to explain. He only looked at her, then at Caleb, then nodded once, and said inside. That night, Joanna stood at the forge's door, staring out into the dark while Eli loaded slugs into a rifle she hadn't seen before. Levi left this, he said, holding out the red family weapon. You want it? She looked down at it, then away. No, I don't want to touch that thing again. I'll use it then, he said simply. You really willing to stand between me and them? She asked. I'm not standing between, Eli said. I'm standing with big difference. Joanna closed her eyes. For a moment she said nothing. Then finally she opened them and whispered, Then I guess I have to stop running. You were never running, Eli replied. You were protecting what mattered. And the moment hung there, fragile, tense, unspoken, until a sharp knock hit the forge door, not fist the butt of a rifle. Eli didn't flinch, neither did Joanna. They both turned and stepped toward the sound. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, deliberate and cold, echoing off the iron and stone of the forge like a threat wrapped in politeness. Eli didn't move right away. He simply set the red rifle down beside the hearth, stood up slow, and fixed Joanna with a steady glance that said everything without speaking. If you open that door, the past doesn't stay buried. Joanna nodded once she knew that already. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot, eyes wide but silent, gripping the wooden horse Eli had carved him 2 nights before. His knees bounced, his jaw was clenched, but he didn't ask questions, not anymore. He'd seen too much too fast to expect soft answers. Eli crossed the floor boots, thudding softly, and opened the door. A man stood alone on the threshold. Not Levi, not any of the brothers. This one was lean, sharp-featured, with a bowler hat that didn't suit the dust on his boots or the worn sidearm strapped tight at his hip. He held no rifle, no torch, just a folded note and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You Eli Garner? He asked, though the tone suggested he already knew. I am, Eli said. The man tipped his head slightly as if that answer satisfied something. Name S. Knox Blythe. I work for the Red Boys. He held out the note. This is for the lady. Eli didn't take it. She can't be bothered right now. Knox's smile twitched. Well, now that's a shame. They'll want an answer by sundown. They always do, Eli replied. There was a long pause then. The kind of pause that dares a man to act first. Knox didn't blink, neither did Eli. Behind him, Joanna stepped closer, her hand brushing Caleb's shoulder. I'll take it, she said, voice low. Eli didn't look at her. He just stepped back far enough to let her through. She took the paper, unfolded it, 3 words, all in Levi's familiar scrawl. It's time, Joe. Nothing else, no threat, no place, no explanation. But she knew what it meant. The meeting. The reckoning, the one they'd tried to avoid for 13 years. Knox turned, but before he stepped off the porch, he glanced back. Pretty piece of iron you've got in there, he said casually. Father's, wasn't it? He didn't wait for an answer, just walked back to his horse and rode off, dust rising in his wake like smoke from a smoldering fuse. Joanna stared at the note until the ink blurred. They won't stop, she whispered. Even if I stay silent, even if I walk away again, they want it ended. Eli leaned against the doorframe. Then you give it an ending. But what if it's the wrong one? He looked at her steady. Then at least it's yours. She folded the note, tucked it in her pocket. I need to show you something. He followed her to the wagon. From beneath the bench, she pulled a wrapped bundle, not the rifle but a smaller package wrapped in leather and cord. Her hands trembled slightly as she undid the knots. Inside was a stack of letters, dozens of them folded and worn edges frayed. Eli raised an eyebrow from them. She shook her head from him. Your father, No, the man who should have been. Her voice cracked. His name was Thorn. He taught me to read, to shoot, to fix a wagon axle with nothing but twine and a prayer. He worked on our land for 7 years. My father hated him. My brothers hated him more. Said he was soft, said he was turning me weak. Eli said nothing, he just waited. He left after they beat him nearly to death in the woods behind our homestead. No one talked about it. No one apologized. He left and I never saw him again. But he wrote every month until the year Caleb was born. You think they did something to him? I know they did. Her voice was steel now, and I think the only reason they're here now bringing back father's rifle like it's some twisted family heirloom is because they want to bury what they did to both men. Eli crouched beside the wagon. And what do you want? Joanna looked down at the letters, then toward the hills beyond the forge. I want my son to grow up not haunted by silence. He nodded once then. Let's drag the ghosts out into the daylight. By noon the plan was set. Joanna would meet them at the southern ridge not with fear, not with blood, but with truth, with the letters, with the one thing they'd never faced memory. Eli would go with her, but stay hidden unless things turned. They didn't tell Caleb where they were going. He sat on the porch swinging his legs and humming softly to himself. Joanna kissed the top of his head and whispered, "Be good. We won't be long." He nodded, but his eyes followed her all the way down the trail until the trees swallowed her whole. The ridge sat like a broken spine over the town, rocky, sharp-edged, and full of echoes. By the time they reached the clearing, the 3 brothers were already waiting, Levi, Jed, and Micah. All 3 stood beside their horses, guns slung loose, expressions unreadable. "You came," Levi said, sounding surprised. "I'm tired of running," Joanna answered. She held no weapon, just the bundle of letters bound in their old leather wrap. Levi eyed the package. "What's that? Your answer." He reached for it. She didn't let go. "These are his words," she said. "Every one of them letters he sent me. Letters you burned, letters you buried." Jed shifted uncomfortably. Micah looked away. Levi stared hard at her. "You think bringing that up now changes anything? It should." Why his voice rose. "Because some hired hand sweet-talked you out of believing your own blood. Because he taught you to read and write and stitch a wound. And suddenly you forgot who you were. I remember who I was." She snapped. "That's the problem. I remember who I was when you tied him to a tree and left him for dead. I remember who I was when you laughed about it at supper." Levi's face darkened. "You don't know what it was like, what he could have done to us. He did nothing but try to help." Eli stepped out of the trees, then rifle slung over one shoulder, calm and solid. "That true?" he asked. "Or is this about power, about making sure the world never sees what cowards you really were?" Jed reached for his gun. Eli raised his slow, not aiming, just reminding. "We're not here for blood," Joanna said sharply. "But I will not lie for you. I won't raise Caleb with your version of what happened." Levi stared at her for a long time. Then without a word he turned, walked to his horse and pulled something from the saddle. A tin box. He held it out. "You want ghosts here." Joanna didn't move. Levi tossed it to the ground between them. It burst open. Inside a handful of scorched papers, letters. The rest of Thorne's words burned but not gone. "We kept some," Levi said. "Didn't know why. Maybe we thought we'd need them." Joanna crouched, slowly picking one up. The ink was faded, the edges singed, but she could still read the first line. "Joe, if you're reading this, it means they didn't win." She looked up at her brothers, something breaking open in her chest. "You can keep pretending you're right," she said softly. "But I won't not anymore." Then she stood turned and walked back toward Eli. The sun dipped low behind the ridge. No one fired a shot. No one spoke again. The silence was louder than any gun, and as they walked back toward the forge, Joanna felt it for the first time in years. Not safety, not peace, but something close. Joyce. The box sat untouched on the forge table all through the night. Joanna didn't open it again. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough. Thorne's words, burnt, broken, surviving anyway, weren't just paper to her. They were witness, and sometimes bearing witness was enough. But Eli knew she hadn't really slept. He could tell by the way her hands moved the next morning, sharp, precise, never pausing longer than they had to. She swept the forge, scrubbed pots that didn't need scrubbing, restacked firewood he'd already stacked clean. Caleb helped quieter than usual, watching his mother like he could feel something had cracked inside her, and was trying to guess what would come through. Late morning brought no writers, no notes, no demands. Just wine through the trees and a too blue sky that made everything below feel like it was waiting for something. "Storm is not coming," Eli said, watching her from the doorway. "But you're acting like it is." Joanna didn't look up something S coming. He waited a moment, then stepped aside as she passed with the broom. "You're thinking about leaving again." She paused mid-sweep. "It's crossed my mind. You think it'll fix something." She leaned on the broom handle and stared at the forge's brick wall. "I think it'll keep Caleb away from the things I've dragged behind me too long." Eli crossed his arms. "You're not dragging them, they came looking. That's worse. You said you were tired of running." "I am," she snapped. "But there's a difference between standing still and waiting to get shot." Eli said nothing for a while. Then, with the same quiet steadiness he always carried, he replied, "Maybe. But there's also a difference between running and building a life somewhere. They can't tear it down." She looked up then, and for just a breath, the fight in her eyes flickered. "Don't build it in ash," he said. "Build it where the fire didn't reach." The forge stayed quiet the rest of the day. It wasn't until sundown that the next knock came. Not sharp like Knox's, not lazy like Levi's. This one was hesitant. 2 soft raps, then silence. Joanna opened it. Micah stood there alone. He looked younger than he had before, like someone had peeled off the layers of swagger and brotherly cruelty and left behind a man who wasn't sure where he stood anymore. "I came to talk," he said. Eli moved behind Joanna, not threatening, just present. Micah glanced at him, then back to her alone, if that's all right. She didn't respond at first. Then finally she stepped outside and shut the door behind her. They walked to the wagon, same one she'd driven into town, same one Thorne once helped her rebuild in a different life. Micah didn't look at her when he spoke. "I didn't know they kept the letters. I didn't know he wrote all that. You were there when they tied him up." "I was 16. You were old enough to help," she said. "I didn't help," he shot back. "I didn't stop it either, I know that. But I didn't lay a hand on him." "That makes it better?" she asked. "No." He said, "It just makes it true." They stood in silence for a while, the wind kicking dust around their feet. Then Micah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded square of paper. He handed it to her. Joanna opened it slowly, not a letter this time, a birth record. Caleb S. Her throat closed. "You lied," Micah said, not cruelly, just stating the obvious. "We thought he was Thorne S." She folded the paper again. Tight. "He's not." Micah looked at her. "Then why lie?" "Because it was easier than explaining he wasn't yours either. That he was Levi's, that he wasn't anyone's to claim or curse. You don't owe me an answer," he said. "But you owe him the truth." She nodded, folding the paper once more, tucking it into her pocket. "Is Levi planning something?" she asked quietly. Micah hesitated. "He wants to go back to the homestead. To where it ended, to where it started. He thinks if we bury the old man, Say something over the bones, it'll make it right. Will it? Micah shrugged. I don't know, but I think he's going to do it whether you come or not. Joanna stepped back. Thanks for the warning. That's not why I came, he said. Then why? To say I'm sorry it hit her harder than she expected. She watched him ride away under the dying light dust rising soft behind him. That night she told Caleb the truth, not all of it, not the dark parts, but enough that he had family who'd done wrong, and that he wasn't responsible for their sins, that he had the right to grow into himself without shadows dragging behind. Caleb didn't say much, but he leaned into her and whispered, I don't care where I came from. I care where we're going. The next morning, Joanna and Eli packed the wagon again, not to run, not this time to ride north to the place where it started, where the old house still stood, boarded windows, scorched porch, and the graveyard behind it where no names were carved, only memories buried. They reached the edge of the property just before sundown. The Red brothers were already there. 3 horses tied loosely to a rusted fence, a shovel in Levi's hand, the grave halfway dug. He didn't look up as they approached. You came, he said. Joanna stepped down only because I wanted over. It is over. Levi said he's dead. That's not the part that's unfinished. Levi didn't answer. Eli stayed close, his rifle strapped but quiet. He watched the 3 men closely. Joanna walked to the grave, looked inside, just dirt, the casket still sealed. Someone had placed an old hat on top her father's, the one he wore every Sunday, even when there was no church left. Jed broke the silence. We found a letter in his coat pocket. What did it say? She asked. Just one line, Jed replied. Forgive them, they were boys once. No one spoke for a long time. Then Joanna stepped forward and dropped Thorne's letter bundle into the grave beside the casket. Not for her father, for herself. For the part of her that still needed to let go. Levi didn't move, but something shifted in his face. Micah stepped forward. You're not staying, he said. Joanna shook her head. We're not running either. Where will you go, where we're not haunted? Levi pushed the last of the dirt back into the grave. No ceremony, no prayers, just a silence that felt heavier than anything. Then he looked up and said, Be safe. It was the first time he'd ever said it. Joanna climbed back into the wagon. Caleb reached for her hand. Eli took the reins. They rode west, not far, just enough to find a new ridge, a new sunrise, a new place where the past didn't choke the present. As night fell, Caleb curled beside the fire with a wooden horse in one hand and a blanket in the other. Joanna leaned against Eli, and for the first time in years, she didn't brace for the next storm. She let herself breathe because this time she wasn't surviving. She was beginning. They didn't build a house right away. Eli said it was better to wait till the ground thawed proper. And Joanna agreed partly because she didn't have the strength to begin again just yet, and partly because some part of her needed to be certain the peace wasn't an illusion. They camped near an old stone wall west of Tabor's Creek, where the water ran clear and the wind didn't feel like it was carrying someone else's sorrow. It wasn't much, just canvas wagon wood and a fire they kept fed, but for a while it was enough. Joanna found herself waking in the middle of the night, less, not none, just less. The weight on her chest that had once come nightly like a promise had started missing its appointments. Caleb began collecting stones. He'd line them up beside the camp each day, careful and quiet, murmuring names to them only he knew. He didn't ask questions about the letters anymore, and that somehow made it worse, not better, like he'd filed away the knowledge somewhere deeper than she could reach. One morning, Eli came back from a ride with news. Tabor's trading post is rebuilding, he said, unsaddling the mule. Owners offering coin for smithing, says the fire drove out their blacksmith last spring. Joanna looked up from the stew pot. You thinking of taking it? I'm thinking we could use coin, and I'm thinking, I've got hands that only stop aching when I work metal." She smiled, then small but real. "You could teach Caleb." Eli's brows lifted to Smith to build. "Eli considered that you think he's ready. I think he's already building something with those stones of his. Might as well teach him to make things that don't wash away in the rain." So they packed the wagon again, this time not to flee or confront, but to begin. The trading post wasn't far, just 2 valleys east, and by the time they arrived, the place had begun to stitch itself back together. Half the building still bore the scars of last year's blaze, but new beams had been raised and people moved with the rhythm of folks who remembered what hope used to feel like. The blacksmith's workshop stood at the edge of town next to the creek. Its door hung loose on a hinge and the forge inside was choked with soot. But Eli grinned when he saw it could get her breathing again. The trading post owner, a lean woman named Marnie Bishop, met them outside the saloon. "You're the one sent word about smithing?" she asked Eli. "I am. Thought you'd be older. Thought you'd be taller," he replied without missing a beat. She laughed once. "You'll do 50 cents a horse, 30 for wagon wheels, and I'll pay up front for the forge repairs if you start this week." Eli glanced at Joanna. She nodded. He stuck out his hand. "Deal." They moved into the cabin beside the workshop. It was barely more than 4 walls and a roof patched with tin and tar, but it had a hearth and a loft and space enough for a child to line up 100 stones and still not run out of room. Caleb claimed the loft instantly. By sundown, he'd already dragged up 2 armfuls of wildflowers and 3 of Eli's old nails, insisting he was going to build a fence for birds. Joanna stood at the window that night watching the forge across the yard. Eli moved inside it like he belonged there. Shoulders steady, posture familiar. He didn't speak to the tools, didn't worship the heat. Just worked quiet and sure, like shaping iron was as close as he came to prayer. She just turned from the window when the knock came. It wasn't hard, it wasn't rushed, but it landed like a fist. Eli heard it too. She saw him freeze in the glow of the fire, then wipe his hands on a cloth and step out into the dark. Joanna opened the door. And there he was, Thorn older, thinner hair gone gray and eyes gone darker than she remembered. He stood with his hat in his hands, jaw working like it hadn't opened in years. And when he spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Joe," she didn't speak. Couldn't. He nodded once like he'd expected that. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me, but I heard about your father, and I had to know if you were still alive." Still alive, the words scraped something loose inside her. "You're supposed to be dead," she said. He looked down. "I was for a while." Eli had crossed the yard now, rifle slung, but low. "You want something?" He asked Thorn. Not harsh, just protective. Just a word. Thorn said, "Then I'll go." Joanna stepped out, shut the door behind her. They stood under the eaves while the sky cracked open above them. Soft rain, just enough to slick the dust. "I wrote you," Thorn said. "I know I never stopped." "You did." He winced. "I didn't mean to. The letters just stopped coming back. I thought they were being burned. They were. I should have come anyway." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked out toward the forge, toward Caleb's loft window, where a faint yellow glow flickered. "Is he mine?" She didn't answer because he was, and because it didn't matter. "He's ours," she said finally. And Thorn nodded like that answer was more than he'd hoped for. "I'm not here to stay," he said, "just passing through, headed south. There's a war coming down there, and folks like me are needed more than wanted." "You could stay," she said before she realized it. "I wouldn't fit," he replied gently. Then, after a long pause, "But I had to see you one last time to know the fight wasn't for nothing." Joanna stepped forward, then just close enough to reach out if she wanted to. She didn't, but she wanted to. "Thank you," she said. for teaching me to read, for showing me what decency looked like before I forgot what to call it." Thorn's throat worked once. Then he put his hat back on, nodded to Eli, and walked into the rain. Neither of them followed. Joanna didn't cry. She just stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fade beneath the falling water. Inside, Caleb was asleep. His stones were lined on the windowsill, glistening in the rain. Eli lit a lamp, then turned to her with a look that said more than concern. It said he'd seen enough to know when a past wasn't done being carried. "He didn't ask to stay?" she said. "I know, and I didn't ask him to. I know that too." She turned to face him, but it still hurts. Eli stepped closer, nodded once, and said, "I know." She let herself be held then, not because she was weak, but because the strong needed anchors too. Days passed. The forge came alive. People brought horses, wheels, tools, rusted half to hell. Eli fixed them all. Joanna started helping at first with books and ledgers, then with hands. She'd grown up learning to grip a wrench like a weapon, and some part of that returned easy. Caleb asked for nails, then for rope, then for a hammer just my size. Eli made him one, and the boy beamed like it was gold. They were making something. Maybe not forever, but for now. And then 1 week after Thorn left, a stranger arrived. He came into town like he owned it, dressed like money, moved like fire. His horse was black as pitch, his eyes worse. Marnie called him Braddock, said he was buying up land between Tabor and Rossfield, said he was building something. Eli watched the man from the forge window and felt the old weight return to his spine. Joanna didn't trust him, not from the moment he smiled with those 2 white teeth and said he liked her eyes. Braddock asked questions about Eli, about where Joanna had come from, about the boy. Too many questions, too calm, too kind. And one night, when the forge had gone quiet and the moon hung low over the creek, someone left a note on the workshop door. No name, just a question. Does the boy know the truth? Joanna crumpled it in her fist. Eli lit a lantern and the wind outside turned sharp, because peace like spring was never permanent in a place like this. The note stayed in her apron pocket all night. Joanna didn't show it to Eli until the sun broke through the trees, and even then she hesitated before handing it over. It was a small scrap folded twice with those 6 words scrawled in tight, deliberate hand. Does the boy know the truth? There was no signature, no symbol, just the question and the silence that had followed it, hanging over the forge like a fog that wouldn't lift. Eli read it once, jaw tight, then again slower, then set it down on the forge table like it might burn through the wood if he held it too long. "He's not asking for truth," Eli said quietly. "He's asking how much he can use." Joanna leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "He doesn't know who Caleb really is, not yet, but he suspects." Eli shook his head. "Don't matter what he knows, it's what he wants." She didn't answer, just stared at the note like it might rewrite itself if she looked long enough. Outside, the day moved on like it didn't care what shadows had slipped in overnight. The trading post bustled with wagons, horses, folks hauling lumber and laying stone. Eli had 2 blades in the fire and a third to finish grinding before midday. Joanna had errands. Caleb had lessons, but none of it felt normal anymore. Not with Braddock's arrival turning every glance into suspicion. By noon, Marnie Bishop came calling. She didn't knock, just stepped into the forge with dust on her sleeves and worry plain on her face. "I don't like him," she said. Eli didn't ask who he didn't need to. "Braddock S. made offers to 3 families already," Marnie continued. "Big One's gold promises said he's building a rail spur, but that don't explain why he's asking so many questions about you 2. Eli paused in his hammering. "You tell him anything." Not a word. Joanna stepped in from the side room, brushing iron filings from her hands. "Did he say anything else?" Marnie hesitated. He asked about the boy. Joanna's breath hitched. Marnie noticed, said something strange too. Asked if Caleb's father was still around. Said he'd heard rumors about a man named Thorne passing through a week ago. Eli and Joanna locked eyes. He's digging, Eli said. And he's close, Joanna added. That evening the forge stayed dark. They kept lamps low and windows shuttered. Caleb noticed, of course, but said nothing. He sat in the corner with his stones, lining them up along the floor one by one, like a quiet army. Eli worked silently at the table, reshaping a busted wheel, spoke just to keep his hands moving. Joanna watched the window, listened, waited. Near midnight, someone moved past the cabin's slow, measured steps. Not a drunk, not a friend. Eli was up in an instant, rifle in hand. The window cracked just enough to catch the edge of movement. Joanna knelt beside Caleb, pulling him close, whispering calm. Outside, nothing. Just the night, the wind. Then a flicker of light far side of the yard. The forge was burning. Eli was through the door before the flames took hold. Joanna behind him. Caleb huddled with the stones still clenched in his fists. The forge wasn't fully engulfed, not yet. Just smoke, oily and sharp, curling from the kindling stack. Eli beat it down with the old canvas tarp, smothering the worst of it, coughing hard. Joanna brought water from the rain barrel, dousing coals and blackening what tools she could. It wasn't an accident. The door had been wedged open. Oil had been poured across the floor. A warning not meant to kill. Just a scare. It worked. By dawn, the forge was gutted. Not destroyed, but wounded. Half the tools were melted or cracked. The table was ash. The roof sagged from heat. Marnie came again, this time with a pistol on her belt. I can go to the sheriff, she offered. But Braddock's got connections. Half the deputies owe him coin. Eli didn't say anything. He was already pulling warped iron from the wreckage, setting aside anything salvageable. Joanna sat with Caleb beneath the old ash tree, holding his hands in hers. He didn't speak, just stared at the blackened forge and asked very quietly, "Did I do something wrong?" She shook her head, heart cracking. No, baby, not one thing. That night they didn't sleep. Joanna laid out Thorne's letters again. What was left of them, some she could still read. Others had bled ink until the words became clouds. But one line remained sharp in her memory. She didn't need paper for it anymore. The world will always try to name you. You get to decide which names you answer to. She read it aloud to Caleb. He listened, then nodded. I want to be Caleb Cooper. She blinked. You already are. No, he said really. And she understood. Not Caleb Red, not Caleb Thorne, just himself. Eli returned late from the trading post. He'd found something, scraps of iron, old forged tools, even a new grindstone. Folks had donated what they could not out of pity, out of spite for Braddock. They didn't like what he stood for. He's buying fear, Eli said, dropping the tools onto the table. But fear don't hold forever, not here. Then what does Joanna ask? Eli met her gaze fire. She raised an eyebrow. He nodded toward the charred forge. We rebuild right there, bigger, stronger, let him watch. The next 3 days were work like Joanna hadn't done in years. Sweat, steel, and stubborn will. She helped lay new brick, rehang the bellows, restack the fuel. Caleb fetched nails, handed tools, kept silent vigil with his stones. Marnie brought food. Other traders pitched in. By the end of the week, the forge stood tall again, blacker than before, but not broken. And on the 4th day, Braddock returned. He came on foot, this time alone, hat in hand, smile on. Joanna was at the anvil when he stepped into the yard. She didn't stop swinging. Eli emerged from the shop, rag in one hand, rifle in the other. Braddock raised both palms, not here to cause trouble. Eli did lower the gun. I underestimated you folks, Braddock continued. Didn't think a burned forge would light such a fire. Joanna slammed the hammer down hard enough to split the silence. Braddock flinched. You think you've won something, he said. But this town forgets fast. Let it, Joanna said, we're not staying because it remembers? Braddock's eyes narrowed. Then why are you staying? Eli stepped forward because people like you expect us to run. For a long moment, Braddock said nothing. Then he smiled, cold, thin. Well, he said, turning, we'll see how long your luck holds. He walked away, didn't look back. Joanna didn't relax until dusk. That night they sat around the fire behind the forge, Joanna, Eli, Caleb, Marnie, and 2 others from the post. There was no feast, no speeches, just stew and warm bread and a kind of quiet peace that felt earned. Caleb laid out his stones again. Only this time he didn't line them up like soldiers. He built something with them, a house, a tiny forge, a tree. Eli watched, eyes soft. Joanna whispered, You ever think we'd get this far? Eli shook his head, but I always hoped. She leaned against him, and for the first time since Bitter Hollow, she smiled without weight. But across the creek beneath the shadowed trees, a match flared in the dark, and someone watched them waiting. By morning, the creek was running higher than it had in weeks. Rain had come overnight, soft but steady, soaking into the cracked earth and feeding the roots that clung to the banks like quiet survivors. The forge held through, its smoke rising strong as ever from the chimney. And Eli stood with his sleeves rolled past the elbow, working steel like it was the only thing that could keep his mind from turning. Joanna watched him from the cabin window, brushing Caleb's hair with one hand, the other resting on the birth record tucked into her apron pocket. She hadn't told Eli yet. Not because she didn't trust him, but because the more she thought about that single sentence, does the boy know the truth? The more she realized she didn't fully know it herself. Not all of it. Not the way it lived in her son's blood or how it might twist if ever spoken wrong. Names had weight, and in her life the truth had often carried the heaviest names of all. Caleb sat quiet at the hearth, carving a crooked little tree from one of his stones. He didn't hum like usual, didn't speak. Just scraped and scraped with a stolen file as though turning rock into branches might make sense of everything he'd heard lately, and everything he hadn't. Joanna knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. You feel safe? She asked softly. Caleb nodded without looking up, safer than before. She smiled against his hair. Then that's enough for now. But safety, like everything else that mattered, had a short half-life in a land where dust carried rumors and greed moved faster than mail. That morning a writer came dust-covered, wide-eyed, and bearing a letter with a seal neither Joanna nor Eli recognized. It wasn't local, not even close. The man handed it over without a word, and wrote off again before questions could stick. Joanna unfolded the paper, scanning the tight cursive that sprawled across the page like it had been written in a hurry. Her hands trembled by the end. Eli stepped beside her, brow furrowed. What is it? She handed it to him. The letter was from a man in Junction Ridge. A lawyer said his name was Hollis Granger, said Joanna's name had come up in the execution of a will tied to a man recently deceased, Orson Crowley. She blinked. Crowley, she murmured. Eli turned the letter over. You know him? She shook her head. Only the name my mother used to mention. It said he owned half the territory before the war. Well, Eli said he's dead, and apparently he left something to you. The letter invited her to come retrieve it, nothing else. No details, just an address in a time 2 days from now. No mention of Caleb. Eli asked. No, Eli's jaw tightened. Could be a trap. It could. You thinking of going? I have to, she said. If someone's using my name, I need to know why. Eli glanced toward the forge. I'll go with you. No. She said you stay with Caleb. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw her eyes. This wasn't about courage. It wasn't even about curiosity. It was about unfinished roots. something that had been buried long before Eli ever held a hammer in her yard. So she packed light, left the birth record behind tucked safe beneath Caleb's quilt. Marnie drove her halfway to the next station, and from there she rode a hired buggy into Junction Ridge. It was bigger than she remembered, stone buildings and chimneys belching coal smoke, children darting between wagons, and every face unfamiliar. But the address was easy to find. A law office near the western edge. Inside, Holly's Granger stood waiting. Round glasses, a wide mustache, and a ledger that looked like it had survived more fires than any person had a right to. "Mrs. Cooper, he said I wasn't sure you'd come. You said I was named in a will," she said, stepping inside. He nodded, motioning to a chair. "From Orson Crowley, he died 3 weeks ago. No family, no children, just assets and a list. A list of people he owed. She stilled, and I'm on it." Granger handed her a sheet, not many names, but hers was second from the top. Next to it, one debt unpaid land to be given. Joanna stared what land. Granger walked to a cabinet, pulled a rolled map, and laid it on the table. She leaned over it, traced her finger along the border he'd circled in red. Her heart stopped. It was their land. The land beside the forge, the ash tree, the ridge above the creek. Every step she'd taken since fleeing Bitter Hollow sat inside that red line. "He owned it," she whispered. "He did," Granger replied, "leased it out without ever registering. No taxes, no claims, but it's yours now, legal and proper." She sat back, stunned. "Why would he give it to me?" Granger folded the paper. "Because from what I can tell, your mother once saved his life, pulled him from a river after a train wreck. He promised her something in return. Apparently this was it." Joanna didn't know what to say. "Will you accept it?" he asked. She looked at the deed at her name scrawled beside the seal. "I will." By nightfall she was on the road back to Tabor's Creek. Eli met her halfway. She didn't ask how he knew to come, just clutched the deed in her coat pocket and rested her head against his shoulder as the wagon rattled back toward home. Caleb was asleep when they arrived, but the forge burned bright and someone stood beneath the ash tree. Joanna froze. It was Braddock. It was Thorne. It was a boy, 16, maybe 17, hat pulled low, rifle slung awkwardly across his back like he didn't quite know how to carry it. She stepped closer. "Can I help you?" The boy turned, and everything in Joanna stilled, because he looked like someone she once knew. Not a face she could name, but a feeling. He held out a letter. "I was told to bring this to you," he said, "from someone who couldn't." She took it, unfolded. It slowly recognized the handwriting. Thorne S. The letter was dated a week prior. He'd written it after leaving. Said he was heading south. Said he'd run into a boy on the road who reminded him of himself. Said he gave him a new name, a new chance, told him to ride north, find the woman in Tabor's Creek, and tell her this: "You never owed me anything, but I owed you peace. I hope I found a way to give you that." Joanna lowered the letter. The boy stood silent, watching her like he didn't know what he was to her yet. Eli stepped beside her. "Who are you?" Joanna asked gently. The boy hesitated, then said he called me Ash. She nodded slowly. "Are you hungry?" He blinked. "Yeah." Eli motioned him toward the cabin. "Come on then." And they walked in together. That night, Joanna sat beside the fire with both boys asleep on the floor. Eli's coat draped over Caleb. Ash curled near the hearth like he didn't trust heat yet, but wanted to. She pulled the deed from her pocket, unrolled it, and in the corner, in ink too fine to be coincidence, she saw a signature she hadn't noticed before. Thorne. He hadn't just written letters. He'd made sure this land would be hers, made sure her future wasn't borrowed. She leaned into Eli's shoulder. He looked down at the deed. She nodded. "It's ours." He kissed her forehead. Then we built. But outside, beneath the ridge, 2 figures sat on horseback watching waiting. One wore a coat darker than pitch. The other lit a match with his thumb, and the wind shifted. By morning, silence blanketed Tabor's creek in a way that felt like warning, not peaceful, too still. The creek whispered, the forge hissed, but something in the wind said eyes were watching. Joanna stood on the porch, Caleb inside Eli, sharpening blades without saying a word. And Ash sat out front, clutching Thorn's knife like it knew more about what was coming than he did. They didn't have to wait long. Braddock returned by noon. He didn't sneak this time. He came with a marshal, 2 new riders, and a rolled document claiming ownership of the land. Said Crowley had filed it before he died. Said Joanna had 2 days to clear out or face legal action. Joanna held up her own deed, signed, sealed, witnessed. The marshal barely looked. You'll need a court to sort that. Eli didn't flinch. And if we don't wait, you'll lose everything. Braddock said smoothly. That night, Joanna rode out with Marnie to Fort Benedict. The law wasn't always on the right side, but paper still held power if you found the right hands to press it. They came back 2 days later with more than a lawyer. They brought proof. Crowley's old deed was void, revoked for fraud 6 months before he died. Braddock's claim collapsed on paper before it ever had a chance to build in stone. But he didn't back off. He came one last time, not with words, with men. Guns across saddles. Joanna stood on the porch with Eli and the boys behind her. You lost, she said, on paper, in truth, and in every way that matters. Braddock dismounted anyway. But Ash stepped forward, Thorn's rifle leveled and steady. Try it, the boy said. Braddock paused, saw Eli behind him, Marnie beside him, a town standing tall where he thought only one widow lived. He turned without a word and never came back. Months passed. Caleb learned to carve again. Ash built a cot in the loft and stopped calling himself just passing through. Joanna married Eli beneath the ash tree, and in the cabin above the hearth the deed hung nailed to the wall, Thorn's signature in the corner, like a final whisper that still held. The forge burned steady, the land stayed theirs, and the family they'd made, scarred and stitched together, never broke again.